For attending. This is the opening panel for the II, the International Institute at the University of Michigan's 30th anniversary symposium. And today we will be beginning a panel that's sponsored by the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. I'm just going to briefly introduce the moderator of the panel. This is Professor Ann Lin. She is the Lieberthal-Rogel Professor of Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan. She's also a professor at the Ford School of Public Policy. She works on American politics, U.S.-China relations, and also she works on scientific collaboration and the politics of scientific collaboration. So please join me in welcoming Ann Lin.
Do I need to turn this on or yes? Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for being here, especially being here on such a bright and sunny early morning when you could be doing all sorts of other things, like maybe sleeping for another half an hour. And also welcome to all of the people who are listening in on Zoom. This is set up as a webinar on Zoom, so if you would like to ask questions.
And I think yours is off, not on.
There it is.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
Poor Zoomers.
So I will say that again because unfortunately people on Zoom I think need the microphone. Welcome to you if you are on Zoom. If you will submit your questions through the Q&A function, not the chat function but the Q&A function, we will see them and Mary Gallagher will ask them for you. And so please feel free to come in with your questions. And I want to say the same thing to the audience. I really hope that this will be a conversation. I haven't asked people to do a formal presentation. I have not cursed you with PowerPoints this morning. So what we'll do instead is have what I think is a pretty free-flowing conversation. And I want to encourage all of you, if you have questions, there are microphones set up on either side of the room. Feel free to come up, and if I see you coming up, I'll know you have a question, and I'll bring you in as soon as the conversation allows. And the same thing for the panelists. Feel free to drop in if somebody else has just said something that you want to comment on. We will make this flow as organically as possible. All right, so I'm also going to break tradition by, instead of running through a biography of everybody, by sort of telling you a little bit about them as I bring them into the conversation. And so I'm going to start out with Dan Wang, who's the technology analyst at Geopolitical Dragonomics, and this year a visiting fellow at the Tsai Center at Yale Law School. His work has covered China's technology capabilities, U.S. regulatory actions on export controls, and multinational investment activities in China. But I think for many of us in the room, he is particularly well known for this annual letter that he writes about his experience in China and particularly in the China tech sector. Some of you will have seen a recent op-ed he wrote for the New York Times entitled, "Biden is beating China on chips. It may not be enough." I encourage you to go back and take a look at that op-ed after this conversation this morning, and then to search for his annual letter because it really is a treat. Dan Wang spent all 3 years of the pandemic in China, and so he has a particularly interesting experience to tell us about. And so Dan, I'm going to ask you to come in first because you've written a lot about and know a lot about and talked a lot about the CHIPS Act and its various implications. And so I'm wondering if you can summarize it a little bit for our audience, and then maybe tell us a little bit in particular about why this hasn't been just a U.S. effort, but why other countries have sort of come along with it.
Thank you very much, Anne. To jump straight into chips, everyone, chips is in everything. Chips are not just in our computers now. They're not just into our phones. They're not just in our data centers. They're also in all of our cars. If you buy all of this 5G hype, there will be chips in the traffic lights, chips in our table, chips in my coffee. They're going to be everywhere. And so, if you are thinking about about how important chips are, it is also was revealed by the pandemic that the supply chain for semiconductors, which we also refer to as chips, is actually a somewhat fragile one, something that has a lot of different choke points. It is distributed all over the world, concentrated especially in East Asia, America, and also in Europe. A lot of the fabrication takes place in East Asia, in particular in Taiwan, in particular in South Korea, and some of it in China as well. A lot of the tooling is made by American firms, and in particular a Dutch firm called ASML, which is making very sophisticated lithography equipment for producing chips. And then there are a few other countries that have a role to play in all of this as well. And I think what President Biden has done over the last couple of years since the pandemic is to say that, well, the United States used to be a leader in chips as well. The integrated circuit was really invented by a lot of American companies, and in particular Intel, which was a very important company in chips, has now fallen on considerably harder times, not quite really behind, but having a bit more of a challenge in making the most sophisticated chips in the world. And I think also the White House has decided that given that a lot of the supply chain is over in East Asia and perhaps not quite as stable a place as the White House would really like, well, therefore there should be quite a lot more production happening in the United States, not only because we Americans invented this sort of stuff, but also because we would really like to make sure in the event of a serious trade conflict, any other sort of conflict, that America is still able to produce the chips that go into everything that we touch today, into our computers, into our cars, into our coffee. And so, the Biden administration signed the CHIPS Act. It's been about, I guess, a year and a half ago now, that gives somewhat extraordinary subsidies to the chip sector. It's about $39 billion of direct federal grants into producing fabrication, the actual fabrication of chips, as well as about $13 billion for research and development, as well as a few other parts of the supply chain. And so, with one hand, the United States is trying to build up much more of its chips industry, mostly through these sort of subsidies and other types of policy actions. And with the other hand, it is also trying to push down China's ability to catch up on this pretty critical leading technology. China has never really quite managed to make it to the leading edge of semiconductors. In fact, it is, in the best, I think, case, 5 to 10 years behind on the broad mass of the supply chain. It is trying really, really hard to catch up. And I think, for the context of this discussion, the United States is, offering both sticks and carrots. It is trying to penalize firms that are trying to get any federal funds to from the CHIPS Act, and also making more money in China, and at the same time trying to sweeten the deal for all of these companies to say, well, we're handing you a very big pot of federal funds for you to pursue these technologies. Maybe with that, I think maybe I'll hand it off back to you, Anne, to set the stage and offer your extraordinarily kind introductions for our future speakers.
Thank you so much, Dan. I want to turn to Victoria Chonn-Ching to tell us a little bit about how this all looks from Latin America, how technological collaboration and competition is looking from Latin America. And I want to say in particular, what I forgot to say at the beginning, which is although this is often posed as a US-China issue, the issue of international technology cooperation, and certainly the issue of geopolitical competition, is really a world problem. And so we want to make sure in this conversation, as we do at the International Institute, to really bring the world together in thinking about these problems. And so I want to turn to Victoria Chonn-Ching. She's a postdoctoral scholar and teaching fellow at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California, and she also received her PhD at USC. But of course, we here at Michigan are especially proud of the fact that she started here as a BA in political science and then an MA in Chinese studies. Victoria is also a non-resident fellow at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council, and is particularly well known for her expertise on Latin America and especially Peru. She's written just this year a really wonderful chapter called A Comparative View of Chinese Relations with Peru, where I think she really is able to bring about a nuanced picture of how China is able to, really win other countries over and collaborate with them in some areas, while in other areas really falling flat. And sometimes this is true even within the same country. And so, Victoria, let me turn to you.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here. Actually, it's like coming back home. The last time I was here was in '09, and as a preface, anything that I can say, you can blame it on Mary. I always say that. Last year I said that to an AAS just because she's the one who started me on China studies and what have you. Anyways, thank you for the kind introduction. And I think that I'm going to turn a little bit away from the conversation of chips, or semiconductors, even though it's important, and bring it back a little bit to the geopolitical US-China, I guess, relationship that is going on right now and how other parts of the world, in my case in Latin America, we view it. And I think that for those of you who were not here, David Lampton, who gave the keynote speech yesterday, did a fantastic job in giving you the perspective of how to understand, right, this dynamic in the context of Southeast Asia. And I wish I was telling Mary earlier that I could recorded his speech, switch Southeast Asia with China, with Latin America, and just like use AI to put my voice in it and just present it. But anyhow, to the point is that when we think about China in Latin America, particularly in terms of technology and whatnot, we have a developing region that's still building infrastructure, that is still depending a lot on other countries and more, I guess, powerful countries, if you will. So China has been really good at providing the kind of economic support and financial support that we got. And I think that in the context of semiconductors, something that has been very fascinating is that Latin America actually has, some countries have actually looked at it as an opportunity and taken advantage of it. For instance, you can see Costa Rica, which Intel was there until 2009, and then they came back in 2020, and they are the only, I guess, facility to put I don't know that lingo or anything in technology, so you pardon my ignorance in that regard, but it's sort of the assembling factory. So right now, with the tensions going on, they're actually saying, hold on a second, we can take advantage of this, and we are actually trying to be some of the main producers and manufacturers in the region, right, given the tensions. Why do I bring that example? I bring that example to say that even though we think about Latin America as a whole, in general, homogeneous region, and the reactions to China, which has been the conversation in the past 20 years, is taking over, right? That's not so true. Simply because here is where the domestic dynamics, here is where the conversation about the different actors do take place. If we think about technology in the semiconductors, like I said, countries will try to be strategic depending on the national and economic interests and say, well, here's where I can take advantage of it, so it's convenient for me, right? In the case of Costa Rica, as I have it right now, to have a negotiation with the United States, and we can agree with something. I can bring the example of Huawei, which I think in the last couple of years, right, there have been a lot of conversations, particularly in countries in the European Union, who are not in banning the company. In the case of Latin America, actually, that's completely the opposite. Huawei has at least more than 50% in the market in terms of providing the equipment for telecommunications, for example, in many Latin American countries, at least 20. When it came to the conflict, right, particularly with the United States, countries just try to stay neutral, or some of them said, we are not going to ban Huawei. That's not to say that they are not aware of perhaps some issues when it comes to security and what have you. But again, I bring back the conversation that this is a region that needs the infrastructure. So a company as big like Huawei can go there, and it has been since the late 1990s, in providing not only infrastructure capacity to build 5G, for instance, Wi-Fi, also brings the equipment that, funnily enough, even American companies like AT&T depend on. So they even will buy, right, that kind of, I guess, the equipment that is from China, and that creates a kind of interesting dynamic. So I think that I wanted to highlight that because something that at least that I want you to remember, since it's so early, and myself, I'm still in California time, is that when it comes to China-United States relations and how at least this part of the world views it, I think some of the criticism that has been particular towards the United States has been that when China goes there to either invest or to bring deals and what have you, right, the Chinese go there and say, let me know what I can offer to you, right? It doesn't go there and say, you can come in here or I can negotiate with you, but don't negotiate with the United States. In fact, what a lot of Latin American countries want, they want to be able to negotiate with the United States and also negotiate with China. So for them, it's more about options. Because something that has stepped in my mind throughout all my years doing research is that when you don't have any options available, despite all the issues that it comes with security, perhaps even issues with ideology and what have you, when you don't have those options, when you have limitations, you take what is available. And China has really brought a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the financing, and a lot of the resources that other partners in one way or another have left behind, or rather have stayed more stagnant in the last couple of years. So, and I think that that's a really quick overview, and I hope that we can give space to the other speakers too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I'm really glad that you used the word infrastructure, because I think there is a tendency to think about infrastructure in relation to China and think about high-speed rail, think about highways, think about all the bricks and mortar things that are incredibly important, especially in a developing country, but to miss the fact that these technological advancements are also really important infrastructure, and countries need to, especially developing countries, need to find a way to move into it. I think one way where this is really clear is in the area of financial technology. And financial technology is especially interesting, I think, because despite the fact that the US dollar is the world's currency, despite the fact that so much of the world's economic system is really anchored by the United States, financial technology in China is really an area where the US has been able to give no competition, largely because, of course, of Chinese policies, but then that China has used that opportunity to really create a fintech architecture that the US has that is way more advanced than what is happening in the US, and has also now the ability to bring that elsewhere. And so to have that discussion, I want to bring in Martin Chorzempa. Martin is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. He's been a Fulbright scholar in Germany, as well as a Luce scholar at Peking University's China Center for Economic Research. His research focuses on financial technology and digital currency, and I really want to commend in particular his recent book, The Cashless Revolution, China's Reinvention of Money and the End of America's Domination of Finance and Technology. I had the opportunity to read this book because he was on this panel, and I have to tell you that that's one book that is absolutely going on my syllabus this winter. So Martin, please.
Awesome, thank you. So I moved to China in mid-2013, and I always tell this story when I'm introducing this area. It felt like going back in time in many ways, because I couldn't use my credit cards anymore. Even my China UnionPay card that I got once I got a Chinese bank account wasn't really accepted at many places in Beijing. Everybody was paying in cash. People weren't even really using Alipay to split bills at that point. It seemed very backward. The financial system was completely based on financial repression. So there were limited options for people to invest. There were some wealth management products at that point, but deposit rates were capped by the government. For much of the 2000s, it was under the rate of inflation, and there were very few options for credit. And then when I left China in mid-2015, it felt like I was going back in time again because China had leapfrogged ahead. And the thing that was so interesting about the China model is that it allowed the big tech firms to come in and be real competitors to banks. fintechs. And they had so many advantages that made them able to do that. They had huge user bases, they had good technology, lots of capital, and a lot of political influence, which they were able to use to make sure that the incumbents didn't squash them. And in many ways, it's the opposite of the US, where we had a lot of regulations on financial technology that made it struggle to grow here. So in a sense, China was this libertarian paradise for fintech in a way the US was not, and that allowed a lot of innovation. So I've been asked to kind of touch on a little bit, not just the US-China dynamic, but other countries as well. One thing I want to say about why this worked gets into kind of how they interact with the world. And there's this view that China has these successful tech companies in part because of protectionism. That blocking Facebook and Google and restricting Google and limiting foreign credit cards was really what allowed China to have this incredible success. And there is something to this infant industry argument, but what I found in my research is actually the threat of foreign competition was one of, if not the most important driver of innovation in financial technology in China. If you look at why Jack Ma decides to launch a business to consumer, kind of a consumer marketplace, which is called Taobao, and why he launched Alipay, which is this amazing payment platform, it's because eBay and PayPal were entering the Chinese market, and he was afraid that if they came in and got a big enough foothold, they would dominate the market. He'd never be able to compete with them. So instead, he rushed to introduce this thing. And meanwhile, in areas where there was protectionism, like in credit cards, where Visa and MasterCard were severely restricted in what they could do in China, you had very little innovation. And if they had done a good job, UnionPay, with its protectionism, then everybody would have been using debit or credit cards in China by the time I moved there. They had more than a decade of full state support to build it, but they never did. So I want to talk about the other international element, which is how has this done abroad? Because there was a sense a few years ago that these Chinese technology companies, especially financial technology companies, were going to take on the US dominance of the global financial system. And that includes the fact that all over the world you find people who use US branded credit cards. And in fact, that hasn't happened. And in a sense, it's because of increases in national security concerns that really maps in interesting ways. So India is maybe the best lens for this. WeChat, which is China's leading social media platform, it's an app run by Tencent, which is the largest social media and gaming company, tried really hard to get that to work in India. And for a while, it was a little successful. And then there were these rumors that the Indian security services were going to ban it because it was a national security risk to have a Chinese app running Indians' communications. Meanwhile, they seem to have no problem with WhatsApp, owned by Facebook, to be dominating their social media side. And now WhatsApp has launched payments. But then you also have an Indian competitor, Paytm, which has major investment from Alibaba, from Alipay, but has tried to distance itself and say we are a fully Indian company, even though a lot of their tech stack is actually plugged right into to Alipay and uses it. In Indonesia, they have said it's completely fine for Chinese tourists to use these super apps created by Chinese tech companies for Chinese tourists, but we don't want any Indonesians using it because we're concerned about the data gathering. And so you see that even outside the US, there's a lot of national security concern about China and apps. Of course, many of them are all using TikTok now, but India has banned all sorts of Chinese apps and has done that. So I think it's really interesting how these companies that we thought in the U.S. were going to be a major threat internationally were not, in part because of the geopolitical advantages that the U.S. has. And that's only been exacerbated by the actions that China's taken to kind of kneecap some of these technology companies. The more that they are perceived as not separable from the party state, the more they can't guarantee that the data they gather on people abroad will not be brought back to Beijing, the harder it is for them to justify allowing them to gather sensitive data on people outside of their home country. And so we have plenty of problems here with whether the legal safeguards about data access from the U.S. government, from U.S. firms, how well those actually work. But in China, that's been a major roadblock. and another is that they've struggled to adapt to other markets. But I always say the other thing is Alipay at one point was completely dominating the payments landscape in China. And then the WeChat used social media advantages to suddenly, within the span of about a week, actually, during one of China's holidays, to become a major competitor and eventually reach about parity with them in payments. So Jack Ma thought he had complete dominance lock on that system, and then new technology disrupted that and created a competitor. And I think the U.S. needs to be really careful about complacency and being the Alipay in that scenario that could be disrupted by China, because we can't count on them not managing to succeed going forward.
Thank you so much, Martin. And I'm really glad you brought the national security issue front and center, because it really is a wonderful transition to Maggie Lewis. Maggie Lewis is Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Institutional Operations, and also Professor of Law at Seton Hall Law School. She is a China and a Taiwan expert, having served as a Fulbright Senior Scholar at National Taiwan University and a visiting professor at Academia Sinica. I want to say here, though, that Maggie Lewis has also really been a heroine in a really important area of these issues around international technology, collaboration, and geopolitical conflict. And that is a heroine in the area of defending Chinese-American scientists in the United States. As these investigations of Chinese-American scientists in, even earlier than 2015, but really started getting rolling in that early period, a period I will mention prior to, in the Obama administration, prior to the Trump administration. There were lots of Chinese-American scientists who were waking up to the fact that they were being investigated, and that somehow this, it wasn't just individual, there was a concerted strategy. There were some China experts, and I want to call out Mary Gallagher here, as well as our former colleague Yashen Huang at MIT, who were paying attention. But there were very few people who had an expertise not only in China, but also in American law, and who were really able to sort of excuse me. You're impressive, but maybe not that impressive. Who were really able to bring that legal perspective and be able to tell scientists, look, if you're arguing against new laws, if you're arguing against new regulations, these are the kinds of policies that you should be looking for. These are the kinds of provisions that really should be there. And so Maggie has really been out front and center on this issue, and and that's what I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about, how, I think something you said yesterday was really useful, how sort of a criminal justice logic has intersected with a national security logic, and then moved into this area of science, which really, at least for scientists, did not understand that they were, part of either world at all.
Well, thanks, Anne, for that exceedingly kind introduction. And I'm not a technology person, and I certainly can't control your microphone from this side of the table. But and I'm so happy to be here to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the International Institute. And I was thinking with Martin saying 10 years ago, so I guess the 20th anniversary when you were first in China. I'm going to take it back a little bit further to when it was founded in the early mid-90s, when I was first in China, that was still the tail end of having foreign exchange certificates, where you didn't even have the ability to use renminbi as a foreigner. So how much has changed? But then I worked at a law firm as a paralegal before law school in Beijing, and one of our clients was Tsai Inc. And you might remember there was this craze about beanie babies, these little stuffed animal creatures with beans inside, and they were being pirated at just amazing rates. And Tsai Inc. was on a vendetta. They're putting like holograms on it, but that was the intellectual property property theft that was really on the radar screen, was pretty low, very not just no-tech things. And it's so different today. I just can't believe how different. But I also think of the 90s, which was when, at the end of the 1990s, where we had the case of Wenho Lee, a Taiwanese-American scientist who was working in nuclear physicist, and so real national security concerns. But the U.S. government accused him of being a spy, threw him into solitary confinement, which is an exceedingly harsh and I think human rights violation for anyone. But it was a completely botched investigation. Ultimately, the government apologized to him. I will say we will never know exactly what happened because the investigation and prosecution was so flawed. But regardless, it was clearly fueled by bias and xenophobia, and I think that sort of resonates today. And as Anne said, even under Obama, this was something that was heating up. In particular, the case of Xiaoxing Xi, who's a professor at Temple. In 2015, the U.S. federal government showed up at his door, guns drawn, and held him and his family at gunpoint while they investigated him for being essentially an economic spy. Those charges were completely dropped, and in fact now he's been suing the U.S. government for both warrantless surveillance as well as his treatment during that arrest. And I'm happy to say that one of my colleagues, John Hafetz at Seton Hall, is working on that case along with the ACLU, and they had a favorable ruling. I'll spare you all the details from a federal appellate court, which has kept the case going essentially. But it also has shown how difficult it is to get recourse when there is a baseless investigation that results in real harm to the individual. My involvement in this, just because I teach U.S. criminal law, criminal procedure, but I also have a background in China studies, and for so long, sort of Asian American studies and Asian American advocacy issues were separate from our world of regional studies, as they should be. A totally different experience. But what happened as U.S.-China relations became tense and that ratcheted up, the domestic reverberations of that tension started to be felt in so many ways. And there's, now we see this, for example, in restrictions on land ownership, and that's being challenged in court. But where I saw it was with this issue about particularly people in the STEM fields, and particularly of Chinese heritage, who suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. And in fact, these were people who had previously been encouraged by their universities to go out and collaborate with Chinese educational and other entities exactly because they had the cultural competency, they had the language skills, they had the personal ties. And suddenly what had been celebrated and encouraged by their universities became a personal liability. So in 2018, when Jeff Sessions, and in his bottom of the ninth inning of his relatively brief time as Attorney General, announced there was going to be a China initiative, unprecedented for the Department of Justice to slap the label of a country on a criminal justice initiative. I remember looking at my computer and doing a double face palm, oh, where is this going? Mm-hmm. And it went nowhere good. And Bill Barr ran with it. And I don't want to go all in the details to take time, but the result was that there were a number of high-profile prosecutions, which were dropped by the government for lack of evidence. We saw judgments of acquittals coming out of federal courts. This means that it's determined by a judge that no rational juror, even viewing the evidence in a light most favorable to the government, could convict. So essentially, the government didn't do its job. It let bias, it let fear creep in, and it made it so what normally are really high-quality prosecutors and investigators made really bad decisions. And even though ultimately the China initiative was dropped in 2022, and when it was dropped, instead they announced the strategy for countering nation-state threats, and it was dropped without an apology, just a recognition of the perception of bias, essentially the government saying, we recognize that people think there was bias in this, but We do not accept that criticism as true, and there's various reasons for that, but it was a non-apology dropping of it. But we've seen since these issues, of course, not going away. I will say that I'm heartened that there's civil society groups, not just the ACLU, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, but new groups like Asian American Scholar Forum that are working very hard with a lot of well-meaning and very effective people in the three-letter agencies that do a lot of federal funding, NSF and DOD and DOE, and with the Office of Science and Technology Policy to come up with better, clearer, more transparent rules so that there can be no gotcha, but rather if you do what you're supposed to do in declaring how you are using federal funds, you should be safe from feeling that you are really in peril of being federally prosecuted. I'll also say personally that it's opened up a conversation that I've been having ongoing with people at the FBI who many of them very much want to do better. And so I think that even there's a lot of bad news and sad news that's come out of this, there's also hopeful news for collaboration among civil society, academia, as well as people in the government.
Thank you so much, Maggie, for that summary and for bringing us up to date on this. When Mary asked me to moderate this panel, I thought, this is a really interesting topic because there's a question here about science and there's a question here about scientists. And this topic really brings both of these pieces together. And so I guess where I would like to go with our conversation next is to ask the different members of the panel to sort of think a little bit about this issue of national security, and many of you have already brought it up. But I guess one of the questions I'd like to ask you is, what are the ways to start evaluating whether there are national security risks or national security concerns in an area of whether it is an area of regulating technology or whether it's an area of collaborating in an area which is less regulated to extending into collaboration. How do you think we should be making those decisions? What are the factors that you think we should be looking at? And so I'm going to just leave that open and sort of ask people to respond to it. But here's also, I think, a really great moment for you, whether you're here in the audience today or whether you're on Zoom, to pose other questions that our conversation has already raised for you. And we will move all of those into the conversation. So national security, how do we judge? How should we start to make these determinations?
Maybe I'll say something quick, which is that I think it is, spending the last 6 years in China, I think, it is very much, much more of a national security state, especially this year when Xi Jinping has said quite a lot about how we have to, the Chinese have to think about, extreme scenarios and, be prepared for the worst is kind of a lot of what he's saying now. And I see, Xi Jinping first and foremost as a disciplinarian who would, he's kind of telling the people that we can be led to national greatness if only you would listen a little bit more. And it is so much of his task, I think, is to notch up the national security consciousness of the entire Chinese state. And I think that sort of mindset is very significantly in the U.S. in parts of the U.S. actually, at least federal bureaucracy as well, starting with Donald Trump, who really equated a lot of national security with economic security. That national security entails having a very robust industrial base, a very robust economic base, that when it comes to particular technologies that we're looking at, it is very clear that things like semiconductors have dual use, in that semiconductors are also in missiles and rockets and all sorts of weapon systems. But under Donald Trump, a lot of other items became thought of as dual use as well. and a lot of things like clean technologies, many other things, so long as there is some sort of economic production here, it can be very easily be bled into national security. And so, maybe I'll just end with a quick note that, national security, if I can tread a little bit on Maggie's toes here, as I understand it, has never been all that properly, strictly defined in the United States. A lot of it is left up to the discretion of the president, and the federal courts are pretty reluctant to challenge federal agencies' decisions on what national security is, so they tend to defer to agency decisions. And in that context, I think it is pretty difficult to define either legally or politically what national security is, and so that I think is the very challenging starting point here.
Yeah, to add on that, I mean, it's really interesting to watch how the Biden administration tries extremely hard not to talk about economic security. And if you look at a lot of the tools that are being used, like investment restrictions in the US, for example, the CFIUS process, there was an explicit decision made to separate and not include economic security as a justification for that. Of course, the boundary of national security is undefined and has significantly grown. But the decision back then was, we don't want this to be used for protectionism. And the problem is that the Trump administration said that washing machines are national security, steel is national security, these kinds of things. And I'll note the WTO, in terms of trade, has this exemption for national security, but there's been a tacit agreement for a long time not to abuse it. So I think it's Sweden at one point came to this and said, our soldiers need boots, and therefore shoes are a national security exemption to the WTO, and we need to protect Swedish domestic shoe production. And one of my colleagues who previously worked at the WTO said that they were treated to derisive laughter, and they, in embarrassment, put their tail between their legs and walked out on it. But we are really in a new world that's challenging, and I think we need a lot of work to understand how to take these seriously. And as an economist, this is something I struggle with a lot in Washington today, because economists are used to being kind of winning the debates on these things in Washington, and now we're losing the debates a lot in Washington, or not really in the debate, because I am not qualified to say whether this specific semiconductor is relevant to the military application. I can try my best, but the security people and the econ people don't often talk to each other very well. We don't speak the same language. A lot of the security people are about contingencies. If we go to war with Taiwan, then we would need these sort of decouplings from China, versus the economist who's saying, here's how much that's maybe going to cost. And a lot of the data required to put real numbers on this stuff doesn't really exist to put these costs on. So it's very, very challenging, and I think we have to work harder at trying to connect the two and be more explicit about it. The administration is often saying, Yellen makes these speeches and says, we will not compromise on national security whatsoever for economics. But the point I'll leave you with is that most of the tools that we're using from a national security perspective on China are really economic tools. Things like export controls, investment restrictions, sanctions on Russia, these kinds of things all work only because of the way that they shape the incentives of economic actors. And if we go too far on them to protect national security, we really do risk, and Dan's done some of the best writing about this, I think it was a Foreign Affairs essay, discussing how it shifted Chinese perceptions so that they don't really rely on American technology anymore in ways that they used to. And you can get in a bad situation where a few years later, you don't have a national security lever to pull anymore, because there's no longer an American firm at the top of that supply chain as the only supplier of that technology. China decides to invest huge resources to innovate around it. So I think these trade-offs need to be taken seriously, rather than kind of rejected as saying, oh, firms want to sell to China and we'll sell out America's human rights and national security to make a quick buck. No, I think those arguments are not taken seriously enough in Washington today.
I mean, if I can chime in a little bit, at least from the more regional perspective and whatnot, and it's interesting that you bring up, saying that we're not going to trade national security for economics. So at least from the Latin America's perspective, I mean, we don't have, or the majority of the countries do not have the architecture, right, to protect against hacking and what have you. So for instance, companies like Huawei have entered, and they definitely are part of the new wave of investment that is coming in creating a cloud. So I'm talking from the consumer perspective, right? So there is concern that what is going to happen with our data, what is going to happen with our information, and yet we don't have the architecture to really protect that, right? That's not only at the consumer level, but also at the national level and whatnot. So then the question becomes, how can we do this? And here is where I think, at least, right, ideally in my world, that partners like the United States or other countries that do have the capacity into bringing that skill, right, that the training and support could come in, which unfortunately I haven't seen as much. Another example that I can give you is, for instance, surveillance, right? Crime is very high in Latin America, many countries, and it is really fascinating to see this dynamic of trade-offs, right? What do I need? So, for instance, Tahua and Hikvision, I think that's the exact name, right? Those are two Chinese companies, surveillance companies, that have provided to countries like Ecuador and even Mexico just recently in 2022 into really helping them with the crime surveillance system. But the issue is, where is the information? How are we going to deal with that, right? What does that mean for us as a country? Because you have a Chinese company that has all these details and information, not only from the security forces, but also from our population. And again, right, I think that there are things that people are thinking about, and yet, again, when the options and the choices are so limited, how do you negotiate that? Because on the one hand, and I think that this is something that David Lampton brought up yesterday, right? We want development, we want these changes, we want all these, I guess, different elements that can help us improve as countries, and yet there are also the personal interests that come at play. There are also the regimes that come and play and say, well, we can provide this to help you, and yet what is the cost? And I think that that's something that is not taken into consideration. So.
Yeah, and thinking about ways to shape the incentives of economic actors, a great way to do that is to threaten criminal punishment. And I do, there's a role for criminal law and national security, and then, of course, the how do you define national security, but when it starts out with sort of old school John le Carre, people stealing government secrets, okay, that's clear. Where it gets more challenging is then when you move away from that sort of paradigmatic case. So, for example, economic espionage, which is the crime that was sort of the marquee crime for the China Initiative, is stealing intellectual property, but not just for your own benefit, but for the benefit of a foreign government or an entity closely connected therewith, which is, for China, thought of quite broadly, given the nexus between industry and government. And they're saying, well, there's a national security aspect because it's not just theft, but it's theft and you're helping out, perhaps an adversary. But then the other crime that you see a lot is false statements or something where it's lying to the government, which is a bread and butter crime used by prosecutors all the time. And in particular, where people have filled out, whether it's grant applications or any other sort of grant forms or had conversations with the government where they've signed something, and they said, well, you didn't either disclose something you had to disclose or you lied on that form. And I believe in transparency and clarity, but there it's also figuring out when is an issue that, well, there weren't enough lines on the form, so I didn't put it down, or I thought it was de minimis. I didn't think it was important, as compared with the really nefarious, oh, yeah, I didn't tell you, by the way, I had this shadow lab in, Hunan or something. And so that's where it's really trying to sort out where is something that is either not actually dangerous to national security, or really, something that might be accidental that we don't think should have criminal liability attached. And when are there people who are actually taking, whether it be secrets or, as we define national security more broadly, economic interests and giving them to a country that might have antagonistic interests to the U.S. And that's where it gets really complicated. One more thing, just thinking of export controls. That's interesting to me because in October, so I guess it's just almost exactly a year ago, when we had the announcement of the Biden administration, so not just under Trump, that was actually saying we're going to make it so U.S. persons, which is U.S. citizens, but also green card holders, could have personal criminal liability for facilitating or advancing China's chips. You had a collective sucking in of air and a quick getting on some planes, because if you violate export controls, we're looking at fines of decades in prison. These are real penalties. And that, for me, was kind of riding this line, is this about national security, or is this about using criminal law to hold back China's development, which is the narrative, I think, that was heard in China. And that, for me, is like, wait a minute here. That's a totally different use of criminal law. To say we're going to actually use it to advance economic interests by tripping up a competitor, and that was that. So that was something which I think was quite jarring and problematic.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting issues here that I want to go into a little more. And the first one I think is privacy, and I think we all, are walking around in a world where we have these polite fictions that our data isn't already being, siphoned and used by Apple and, by Google and by Amazon and all of, name your major technology firm. How much of the concern around data that might be going to China, that China could weaponize against us, against the country, against the company maybe, is a sort of concern about privacy that looks exactly the same as, our concerns about Google or, Apple or whatever. And how much do we really need to see this as as different? And that's maybe not the best way to pose the question, but let me give you an example. If you listen to Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, he has a standard speech about why China is such an important security threat to the United States. And one of the things he says is China is the biggest thief in the history of the world. And then he points to Chinese hacking of millions upon millions of data points about American government workers about, I guess, a decade ago, 7 years ago, something like that. And one of the really interesting things about that data hack is, on the one hand, we know it happened, and we also are very sure about who hacked it. And on the other hand, we really can't, at least in my understanding, point to a loss or a threat that has materialized. Obviously, there's this sort of inchoate threat. And so I think the question here is, how much of this is sort of residing in the world of, we haven't figured out what the threats to our privacy are, and, it just looks even more scary if it's not Apple but China. And how much of it is, no, we actually do understand that there are specific privacy threats that come when another country, not that a country could do if it had your data, but that a country has done when it has its data. And therefore, these are concerns that we really need to be guarding against.
I can gladly take that one. I would recommend anyone really interested in going in depth on this to read some of the testimonies that my friend Sam Sachs has given, going really, really deep into these issues for Congress. Just a few on that. TikTok is probably the one that's most discussed now as a potential threat, and there are two prongs to the argument that it's a threat. One of it is the data access point, and another is the control over information that people end up getting, trying to influence them. And my sense is that all the research done on kind of Russian influence operations and others in lead up to the election, the previous presidential election, did not really have that much effect on people's views. So I generally tend to think the data manipulation point is probably a bit oversold. On the data point, I think you have to be really specific, I agree, about what the threat is. And often the way the US government talks about it is specifically about people with security clearances, people with access to this kind of data. And that's what makes the OPM hack so potentially damaging, because I don't think you can necessarily point to one thing, but every single person now who's in that hack, you have their potential vulnerabilities, all sorts of background about them that could allow someone to pose as them. But I think a lot of what the US government's concerned about is China being able to, with relative ease, with little investment in an individual relationship, to find people who have access to US government secrets who are maybe on tough times or having an affair or these kinds of things that would allow, or is gay and not out, that kind of thing that they could use as blackmail. So it's really not about you and me necessarily, our data. I don't think China particularly cares about that, but it's about a specific subset. And then you have to ask how much are we willing to sacrifice in terms of our openness to the world in order to control that subset of data. And what Sam always says, and I really agree with, is that we've tried to do a lot of this through the CFIUS process, to say if a Chinese firm wants to buy a US firm, we'll kind of cordon off and localize that data. Anything that's sensitive, make sure that the Chinese can't get access to it, or to stop China from being able to buy a US company that has a lot of potentially sensitive data. But the problem is that the OPM hack did not come from buying a US company. They just hacked the Office of Personnel Management. So if you close the front door and don't allow them to buy a company, then they might just find a way without paying anybody in the US to get that data anyway. And another is just our horrendous system of data protection in the United States. The fact that people can just buy your social security number, buy your location data, buy your shopping history, maybe even your browsing history, depending on how you do that. There's just such little data protection that China could absolutely legally go to any number of data brokers out there and get masses of sensitive information, and there is nothing illegal about that whatsoever. So we're trying to plug this tiny little hole in the dike. Meanwhile, a whole part of it is collapsed on the other side of our data being just flowing anywhere. I do think so. What we're concerned about is very different with China. And is less concerning to most people probably than what Apple or Google would do, which might be to target you, figure out how price sensitive you are, and be able to maybe take advantage of you by charging you more based on your willingness to pay, that kind of thing.
I think there's a bunch of things going on here, and so part of it is hacking, where people are really trying to keep information secure, and then someone is breaking in, right? But it's also just this, because we're connected people, that we have vulnerabilities that we click boxes. I'm a lawyer and I never read any of these long "do you agree to" things. But am I worried about TikTok for national security? No, I'm worried it might melt my kids' brains and make them feel terrible about themselves. But part of it is we just have our risk assessment of what is really probably triggering national security. I don't think we're having a rational conversation right now. It's so sort of fueled by what's the sticker of who is it a Chinese company or not, which is very narrow-minded, because one of the things with the China initiative was saying, guess what, other people from places not connected to China also steal intellectual property. This is not, it happens. So let's figure out what's valuable and then protect it from people, no matter where they're cited or no matter what their connections are. I'll say too, with the privacy issue, that there's also, of course, concerns about the U.S. government directly invading people's privacy. And in fact, one of the issues that's come up with the group that was pushing back on the China initiative was also with Section 702, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which has been up for renewal in Congress and was put in as a counterterrorism tool, and serves an important purpose in making sure that the intelligence community can get information. But it has gotten so expansive that what has also been used against Xiaoxingxi and others. And so I think so much of this is making sure that there is a conversation about, how big should the government reach be? I mean, I am grateful that there are people sitting in DC and really drab offices scouring a lot of data. I was in New York for 9/11. I want those sort of, incidents to be stopped before they happen. happen. But if we don't have pushback on the government and making them articulate, why are you doing this? And then having Congress set some guardrails, our own government then overreaches. And so this is going to be a constant iterative process, but it really requires a lot of vigilance on the part of actors outside the government to make the government articulate why they're doing what they're doing, and then when they overstep, to make sure that there is pushback that can be effective.
Let me raise another, Mary, why don't you go ahead, because.
I don't know if people, if you want to ask a question, we have to go up to the microphone, so can I ask
Yes.
a question? I'm trying to also encourage other people to come up to the microphone and ask a question, because I'm thinking that it makes people less likely to ask questions. I don't know why. This is the first time we're trying out this format. I have a question about things that we haven't talked that much about, but and so I'm not sure if people want to talk about them, but I've been thinking about the issue of like upstream inputs into really critical technologies like electric batteries or semiconductors, and the way in which these, whether it's rare earths or lithium in Latin America or cobalt in the DRC, what are the ways in which this really important interdependency on these critical inputs has been, how has that been affected by the competition between the United States and China? So how is it changing how the U.S. thinks about these things, which I think the U.S. generally has tended to, delegate to other countries either because of environmental concerns or costs. And also, what is China doing in this space to make sure that it maintains kind of strategic control over some of it? It seems like China's been much more forward-thinking in thinking about access to these minerals. Thanks.
I think I can answer to that since it's directly to, for those who are not that familiar, so Latin America produces or houses about like 50% of lithium in the world. So we have the lithium triangle, which would be Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. And it's something fascinating, right? Because it's not just US and China going in there and trying to get the minerals. It's also Australia, it's also Canada, it's also Germany, it's pretty much anyone. It has been fascinating. I think that's something that we have been seeing is that China has been trying to get into, and definitely I think got into purchasing some stakes in some of the local mining companies in how to process and extract them. I think the question right now, at least for the region, like for us, I'm Peruvian, so I have to apologize when I was saying us, I meant like Latin America. An issue for us right now is that there are countries, for instance, that are actually thinking about nationalizing it. So that's going to be a different story, right? So when we nationalize it, it's going to be the local companies or the local firms that are going to proceed with extraction. The question is to what extent they want to have those joint ventures with either a Chinese company or a US company or a German company. For sure, China is trying to get in there, and I think that in comparison to the last 15, 20 years, when China would come with this huge mining investment in the extractive industries, right now they are more, and also given the domestic and economic issues in China itself, right? I think that has slowed down in how China is entering the region, or rather than slow down, it has made it more strategic. So right now China is really going to very specific areas. So lithium is one of them, technology is one of them, and I wouldn't be able to say right now, to be fairly honest, to what extent China will dominate, because like I said, right now it's open bidding, right? It's open bid, who's gonna come and who's gonna provide. So I know that at least in Bolivia, there are some Chinese companies that have been in negotiation. Even in Mexico, there was some conversation as well. In Peru, in Argentina, particularly, there has been a Chinese joint venture joining in. There is still no actual processing, but more into how we get there, because again, the environmental issues come at play. And believe it or not, we actually do have environmental regulations with, at least from the Chinese perspective, right, or the Chinese companies, they have been they have had a long way learning about it, but I think that something impressive has been that they have been willing to do so. The question is also how the host countries, right, are going to actually hold not only the Chinese companies, but any other companies accountable, because again, these are minerals that provide a lot of profit, but then the question becomes environmentally wise, indigenous community-wise, what is going to be the effect? So the negotiation is going to be multi-level, not only with the external partner, but also with the local community, the civil society, local governments, and what have you. And again, every country has its policies. And like I said, in countries like Chile, they are trying to nationalize it with the latest president. That's what he said. In Bolivia, there was conversation about that too. So I think that that's still in development, but something exciting to look at. And I guess it gives me more job, something to research for the future.
In addition to the resources, I'll add that a lot of where China has been forward-thinking has been in actually refining and processing a lot of these minerals, and the resources are one bottleneck. I understand the refinery is really the other. These refineries are so polluting and energy intensive that really only China has had the stomach to do a lot of this stuff. The United States really does not want to do these sort of things, to have, there's a lot of local opposition into having a, mineral processor here that is spewing heavy metals into the air, and, it doesn't look too good. My sense is that actually the White House is really trying to get Canada to do this instead. So, it's just a difficult thing to really try to do locally here. China has been able to do a lot of this, and so it's been able to. That's a lot of where the chokehold is.
Well, thank you for a great panel. I've just learned so much, so I want to thank each of you. Dan, you started off, if I understood you right, saying that you thought on chips, and I think it was in the context of Intel, but a more general statement, that China was maybe 5 to 10 years behind, is what I heard. And then I read an interesting, when Secretary Raimondo was there, a new generation of smartphone was released, and there was a lot of talk about, aren't we giving incentives for China to accelerate development, or are they really 5 to 10 years behind? So I just wonder if we're not forcing China to up its game here, and are they really 5 years behind? I know it probably matters in exactly what technology we're talking about, but aren't we in danger of underestimating China's capacity to either find alternatives or generate domestic alternatives?
I think it is a very good idea not to underestimate China. That if I am taking a look at where China is technologically, I would say that outside of semiconductors as well as aviation, and perhaps you can throw in biotechnology as well, I would say that Chinese technology products are not too different from where the West is today. If I am thinking about a lot of industrial equipment, if I'm thinking about a lot of these things where the Germans and the Japanese are really good, most of it is not rocket science. And when I talk to German and Japanese companies in Shanghai, they would say, yeah, our Chinese competition has mostly caught up to where we are, at least in terms of the quality level. They're just not very good at marketing it abroad yet. I absolutely agree with your idea that U.S. actions have really turbocharged China's determination to figure out these technologies. I would situate it not at the level of Beijing, not at the level of central government. I think it is very fair for the U.S. government to say that the Chinese government has tried for a very long time to figure out a lot of these technology deficiencies. Where I would say the U.S. actions, basically starting with what the Trump administration did to ZTE as well as Huawei, both telecommunications companies, is that it has taught China's leading entrepreneurs, a lot of which are very capable firms, to say, well, we cannot rely on American technology. We have no idea when some obscure department housed mostly at the Department of Commerce will just completely deny our ability to access our most crucial inputs. Therefore, they have to cultivate a lot more non-American production, whether that's Japanese production, Korean, European, or best of all, Chinese production. And I think what the U.S. government has done is that it has shifted the buying patterns of China's, a lot of pretty wealthy, pretty capable companies into shifting their orders onto Chinese components. That a lot of smaller Chinese companies would say that Huawei never gave us the light of day, the time of day before. They would never consider buying our products. Now they are all sweetness and light and asking, can we have some sort of technology collaboration here? Not because they're much more loyal to Xi Jinping, but because the U.S. Department of Commerce has forced them into buying products that they previously would never really consider before. I wrote a piece about this, as Martin kindly gestured to, in Foreign Affairs in 2021. And I think the question really is going to be how long China is going to be able to catch up. I think it is a doable process for China to figure out a lot of these technologies. China is only trying to reinvent a lot of existing ladders. You don't need a new theory to produce these sort of things. But there's also a question. They haven't succeeded terribly well in the past. There's some debates that we can have about Huawei's leading phone. I understand it to be at a lower technology level that is much more expensive to produce than what other countries are capable of. But I think this is one of the great questions of the next decade. How quickly will China be able to really catch up here?
So with respect to this question of technology competition, there's the sort of shorter term, what sort of G are we on, and kind of the actual hardware. But fundamentally, the U.S. is going to stay competitive by having the intellectual firepower. And that means the U.S. has to attract and retain the talent, the brain power. That's how we got where we are. And in fact, so many of the absolutely amazing Asian American scholars that I've gotten to know, they came to the U.S. because even before that, they're like, I wanted to be in the US because I wanted this free, open atmosphere in academia and science. And what we've seen is the chilling effect is real. And there's tons of anecdotal stories, but also there's now surveys that are showing that not only is the US a less desirable place to come to study, and part of that is because of also Asian American discrimination, gun violence, you name it, which also is a wonderful thing we've put on a silver platter for the Chinese government to say, do you really want to go to the US? But it's been an own goal to create an atmosphere where people are saying, am I going to be safe doing research here, or am I going to be under scrutiny by the US government? And even if there's not criminal sanctions, if you get cut off from government grants, what's going to happen? The universities are in a situation where the alignment is not necessarily there between the faculty and the administration, because the administration wants to make sure it keeps getting those huge grants from NSF and NIH, and sometimes that means that the individual faculty do not feel that they have some sort of due process when they are under scrutiny. So it's all to say that the U.S. needs to figure out ways to attract and retain talent if we're not just going to keep ahead in the 5-year term, but the 10, 20, 30 beyond that year term.
If I can just add one element, I agree with everything Dan said, and I would add a multilateral element to it, which is really important, which is the U.S. generally has very few areas in which it is the only producer of something. Something you, Professor Lambton, mentioned yesterday in your remarks. And in this case, what's really interesting is that because the semiconductor industry in some areas is extremely concentrated, getting the US, Japan, and the Netherlands together to agree together to control a technology gets you 90+% of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment production of the world, with only 2 other countries. Of course, they didn't agree until a bit later, and their controls are a little bit different than the United States. So it's not a full overlap, but I think that is a potentially useful way to control overreach of the United States, because if you try to control it yourself and they can just buy it from the Germans, it's completely useless as from any sort of national security or economics perspective. It might make you feel good. People in Washington really these arguments don't actually work very well in Washington these days, because there's this kind of sense that China is so evil and so out to get the United States that we have a moral right not to sell something, even if the Chinese will just buy it from someone else. And I think that's really dangerous. But it is potentially useful to have to convince allies to go along with this. And if they can't, then not to do it. And some of the laws that have been passed on export controls, specifically the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, specifically say they have to try to multilateralize these controls. And if they can't, they're obligated to consider getting rid of the control because they understand it's not likely to be effective.
Hello, thank you for your insightful discussion. I'm here the exchange scholar, vice scholar at the University of Michigan. I'm political scientist by training, so from Georgia, not from Atlanta, from Europe. So I have a couple of questions. First pertains to the Chinese political elites and also basically foreign policy makers. How they decide which region is most important for their foreign policy. So I think Victoria talked about Latin America, but quite recently China concluded this strategic partnership with Georgia, and this is very first instance, and it's very unusual. I was wondering your assessment, those scholars who extensively research China and their politics, why they decide to go to a particular region, either Africa or Latin America or Georgia or somewhere else. And we talked a lot about economic dimensions, and usually economic strength translates into political leverage and political power too. So I was wondering to what extent US and China competition changed and shifted following the Russia-Ukraine war? Because economic part was the major dispute between US and China, especially due to the observance of economic sanctions and probably also the cheap policies in terms of military aspect. Thank you.
I can try. Working? Yes. Okay. Thank you for your question. How do Chinese politically decide where to go? I wish I was back in Beijing and be a fly and listen to it. It's really hard to say, right? But something that I can tell you, for example, in Latin America, at least in Africa, about 20 years ago, so that would be early 2000s, early 2030, almost 30 years, a lot of it was driven by commodities, right? So I think that China really goes where it really can't find the resources, at least at that time, and right now in Latin America continues to be that way, right? Where I can find the resources that I need, not only for its own domestic industries, but also part of this, I guess, internationalization, whether in the last 5 years or so, we have been talking about the renminbi, or we are talking about its companies. Just an anecdote. About 10 years ago, when I was doing field work, I was in Beijing, and I was talking to not necessarily a Chinese politician, right, but a researcher, a scholar, and I asked him, well, what is the interest in Latin America? And what he told me was like, we just go there, you have the resources, your commodities, but you're tiny, it doesn't matter. Now move forward, about 10 years later, we're still comparatively small, but yet we are the region, right, that receives a lot of FDI. Perhaps not the first, right, but we are among the top 3, I would say. And a lot of it is particularly driven by the commodities, the resources. Mary just recently mentioned, right, critical minerals, lithium. So China will go to regions, and please chime in, right, where it can find what it needs for specific economic and geopolitical purposes. So the way in which China goes to Southeast Asia, for example, one of my co-authors, right, we work on similar topics. He also talks about commodities and whatnot, but Southeast Asia, given the location, given the history with the United States, I mean, there's also geopolitical strategy. In Latin America, perhaps there is the geopolitical part that, we are the region that is part of the United States and what have you, but China is not going there and say, I'm going there just to displace the United States. They're actually going there because they need the resources, right? Having the United States, that's, I wouldn't say a secondary, but that's a plus if that happens. So it really depends. I think that it would be I wouldn't call it a mistake necessarily speaking, but I think that we need more nuanced conversation about why China goes to specific places. Sometimes it's just to to expand its allies. Sometimes it's geopolitical, sometimes it's economic. So that's, at least in my experience, the answer that I can give you. So thank you.
Gamarjabat, my wife is from Tbilisi, so I appreciate your background and having to explain that it's not the state but the country, which I hear over and over again. This is a great question to talk about China's role in Russia-Ukraine, because I think China does not get enough credit for its restraint in this situation. So the United States has put these incredibly far-reaching sanctions on Russia related to financial transactions with the US dollar, but also really complex export controls, which restrict things with US components or US even technology that even designed the component that would restrict what China can then export to Russia. And what's really extraordinary is that although there have been a bunch of Chinese firms that have gotten in trouble for supplying Russia, they're almost all small fry companies that are not that big of a deal. And overall, you'd think if China was doing a lot to aid Russia's war effort directly, then the U.S. would have responded and put major sanctions. It has not done that. So I think that's a sign, although we don't have full visibility into what China has done, and rhetorically it's given a lot of support for Russia, it has not really provided the material support for Russia. One of the things people give on the other side to argue against that is to say, well, China is buying all sorts of Russian oil. And effectively what that does is it allows Europe to keep its hands clean and say we're not importing Russian oil anymore without massively increasing the world oil price by taking Russia's oil off the global market. So China is kind of a safety valve which allows the moral high ground to be taken without the inflationary implications of high oil prices for the Europeans, kind of saving them from themselves. At the beginning, I was tracking Russia's imports, and China massively decreased their exports to Russia right after the invasion, in part because they needed to understand these new rules and not get themselves in the firing line for US sanctions. Since then, that's gone up a lot. So in effect, China has huge opportunities to profit economically from supplying stuff to Russia that is not necessarily illegal under US export controls, but that US and European firms for reputational and other reasons aren't willing to sell them. So China's kind of won a lot from it economically in that sense, but has definitely paid for it, and diplomatically, at least with Europe especially.
I just want to add quickly, too, that, during this whole conversation, we've been talking about the United States and China, especially China, as if it were monolithic. And I think, Professor Lampton's wonderful speech last night really reminds us that that, of course, the government is very important in directing economic and industrial policy in China, but China is also multiple companies, some of them state-owned, some of them private. China is also, suppliers of foreign direct investment can be Chinese provinces, and as well as, the Chinese government or Chinese banks, et cetera. And so I think one of the really interesting things in your question is that China makes decisions, but also Chinese make decisions, Chinese companies make decisions, et cetera, and sort of thinking about what their different incentives are in that is a really important and interesting part of the story. Please.
Thanks for Margaret's suggestion that I should come to this side to get the attention of the chair. It's really a great panel. I think it's a lot of very interesting and intelligent discussions here. I learned a lot, and I'm coming from Hong Kong, so to come to celebrate this the 30th anniversary of the Institute. Now, I think I'd like to bring back the subject to America. I think the problem to talk about China is really a problem of America, not so much on China. I remember when I first, as a student in the United States was full of, was a very friendly country, very energetic, innovative, and people were so nice to foreign students and foreign visitors. I think Margaret pointed out that one of the great assets of this country is to able to attract people from different parts of the world. So that's how we make America so great. But gradually, in this last 20 years, perhaps Trump and whatever reason, United States for national security interests of the United States, I think start to hack somebody's telephone, even Angela Merkel, people like this. And I think United States was caught red-faced by many of this disclosure. So I think there's a point where you can, how far can you push the national interest issue, And I think actually, you think about the development of the world, it was driven by economic issues. But gradually, if you bring national interest in there, then you come to the problem of whether washing machine is a subject of national interest. That kind of thing is a problem. So I have many, if we can go into this, then indeed, rare earth elements, like cobalt, lithium, nickel, neodymium, all those things will become a national issue of national interest for Central Latin American countries, for Australia, for China, for Canada, for anything. Then I think we're back into the old days. So I think this is a problem of the America. I think we should think about this. And the reason I think is that there are two problems of the America in this last 20 years. One is complacency. The life has been so good, so I think so you want to get the easy way out. I work for a company who wants to say the #1 chemical company in the world, but later on you found that so people come to a leadership position and felt that why should we do R&D? Why don't we just buy this from somebody? So then you start going to the subject strategy of buying and trading and so on. The company gradually lost interest in research, and which is DuPont company, and now it's DuPont company is kind of evaporated. So I think this you can see company like Eastman Kodak company, Xerox, and HP, a number of this company gradually going this way. I think complacency, and we lost the drive, the energy, to get to excellence. So I think this is one of the subjects that we should really, a culture issue, talk about. The second issue, I think we lost courage to face competition. I think the United States was certainly is not the first country to invent electricity or the first country to invent automobile, but with Thomas Edison, with Henry Ford, the United States has been great, making great progress, and not just for the country, for the world in that area, because the United States was not afraid to compete. So you compete in the manufacturing technology. The United States was great in manufacturing technology once. So then gradually you lost that courage. And then what we talk about today about the chip, it's not new. In 1991, I remember very vividly. I get a report. It was Ian Ross, who was the president of Bell Lab. He was written that report to George Bush. Okay, in his capacity as chairman of the National Advisory Committee on Science and Technology Policy. And he raised the issue of semiconductor. He said, Mr. President, if we are losing competitiveness in semiconductor, if we don't do this, then the United States will gradually put the United States in a great difficulty, serious position. And he was talking about Japan. And as as a result of that, United States have set up a lot of policy and Symantec and so on. And the Japanese company like Fujitsu, like NEC, Sony, they become, United States has exercised its great power, economic power, to drive those companies out. But does it bring United States to the number one situation in this technology? No, it did not. So these are not really proper way of competition. So I would like to say that, this is the kind of problem we should face, United States should face, that it is not a problem of China or Japan or all this, Georgia or any other country. I think it is, United States should think about how America, should come back to its, remember the reason for its past glory. It's not by defeatism, not by protectionism, not by being, we should play fair. We should play fair, and we should play, with a really think about the future. Thank you.
I think this is a question that obviously China, there's a rhetoric in China that says exactly this, right? America's the declining country, China's the rising country. We have the energy, we're willing, especially with a government that is willing to invest in science and technology, the future is not in the United States or in the West. The future is in a Chinese government that will, bring other countries along with it. And I'm wondering, I'm sure this is a rhetoric that you've heard often. I'm wondering if you have any sort of quick responses to it.
And I realize we're running up against time, but I'd say thinking of the early 1990s, and I deal a lot with Taiwan, where was Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, before he went to do TSMC? He was at Texas Instruments in the United States, and I think he essentially, part of it was he hit a ceiling that he couldn't go any further, and so it goes to this, it is a long-term problem. This is not new, and thinking about how the U.S. stays competitive. I spent most of my career criticizing China's human rights record, and I always say I have plenty of energy to criticize multiple governments simultaneously, because most governments have something to criticize. And I'll say what gives me hope, and I am fiercely patriotic, and that's why I've spent so much time and energy criticizing the U.S. government, is because I know we can do so much, and that is good, and that there's a reason that our universities remain the premier places that people want to study. It's because we have a fundamental research system which is still thriving, if under some peril. And so I totally agree, we need to double down on what are the American strengths. It's openness, it's investing in brain power, and I also, a lot of these, when we have these cases that go to criminal prosecutions, I am happy when they go not through plea bargains, but through a trial, because it shows the system of making the government show up in court and prove every element of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury. And that is the most powerful statement about how there are still some checks on our government. So with all the darkness and complications that we have ahead, I still think there's a lot of reasons to think there's real hope for the U.S. to come out in a very strong place down the line.
I think we need to leave it there, yes. So I really want to thank the panel. I think they've given us a really fantastic and really content-filled discussion. I also wanted to just point out too, I know there were many students in the room, and I actually was hoping to have a little time to have everybody talk a little bit about their own background, because I think this is a really interesting panel of people who have a deep interest in international affairs and have pursued it through many different ways, whether it's through law, like Maggie, whether it's through a think tank like Martin, whether it's through the university like Victoria, or whether it's through, the private sector as Dan. And so I encourage the students in the room, and I see in particular many of our students who are in Chinese studies, to really take advantage of the fact that these great people are here, and have a chat with them about, your own ambitions, think about, your own options for the world. There are lots of ways, I think, to make a great career, and to do a lot of good in the world, with an international and regional studies background. So thank you very much to this great panel. Thank you all for being here, especially at 9 in the morning. And we're going to yield to the next really excellent slate that we have for the rest of the day.